This presentation will review the administration, scoring, and interpretation for writing and spelling CBM, and I encourage you to look at the end of the AIMSweb training books for writing and spelling. There are sample problems, so take a look at those and how they are scored too. For CBM writing, you provide the student with a story starter. So, for example, the best thing I ever ate was, or I had a great time when. And then you give the student 1 minute to think about what they will write, and then you provide 3 minutes for the student to write the story. And the most commonly used measures for writing CBM are total words written, words spelled correctly, and then correct word or writing sequences. Total words written is just a pure number count, and misspelled words are included in the count. We don't count numbers written in numeral form. If you look at morpheme separated by a hyphen, it's each word counts separately as long as they can stand alone, and symbols don't count, so if they use an ampersand. Then for words spelled correctly, this is you're going to look at correct within a low inference judgment about what they intended to write. So if they wrote, I ate a piece of candy, and they spelled piece, P-E-A-C-E, then you would probably count that as misspelled. It doesn't take much inference to determine that they meant to write P-I-E-C-E, so that would be counted as misspelled. Or you can go through and just look each word independent of context and just decide that piece is a word, that is a correct spelling of a word piece, and count that as a correct spelling. So typically, however, we use low inference judgment, and it would count in that sample, we would count that as misspelled. We look at each morpheme separated by a hyphen. Again, is counted as an individual word if it can stand alone, so they may spell part of the hyphenated word correctly and the other part incorrectly. Common abbreviations are counted as words. Proper nouns must be capitalized to be correct, and apostrophes are required if the word can't stand alone without it. And these little in parentheses here, typically when I get a writing sample, what I would do is go through and first underline total words written, then go through and put a box around the misspelled words. And this is just kind of a system to organize yourself as you're, gathering these data. Correct word or writing sequences. You're looking at each successive pair of writing units, and that includes punctuation. And they must be correctly spelled and grammatically correct, and those two units together will count as a correct word or writing sequence. And here I would go through the sample and write a little caret to connect them, and you'll see that in your AIMSweb training workbook as well. Reverse letters are okay as long as you can tell what the word is. You have to have the correct punctuation. Syntactically and semantically correct words are correct writing sequences. So you can't have a word in there that doesn't actually make sense. You can't be scoring correct writing sequences in something that is the sentence structure is incorrect. The initial word of a sample is counted as a correct writing sequence. Titles count. Numbers in numeral form are not counted unless they're dates. And hyphenated words are considered as one. So this is different from when we talk about total words written and words spelled correctly. Here it's going to be considered one, not two words. Like I said, the back of your AIMSweb training manual has a lot of good samples, but I just wanted to walk you through a few for correct writing sequences because it is a little trickier than just counting the words for total words written and words spelled correctly. So the first sentence, I went to the movies. Looking at that, remember we're going to get a correct writing sequence for the first word in the sentence, the very start of the sample. And then I went is correct, went to is correct, to the movies, and then you're going to get a correct writing sequence for movies to the period because that is correct punctuation there for a total of 6 correct writing sequences. The next sentence, do you want a cookie, which should be a question. They're missing out on that initial correct writing sequence because the do, that should be a capital D, so that's incorrect. And because it doesn't have the capital D, then you can't give the correct sequence to do you either. Then you go through, U1 is correct, want A is correct, but then because cookie is misspelled, we can't give correct writing sequences there. And further, if cookie had been spelled correctly, we wouldn't have been able to give the correct writing sequence between cookie and the period, because that would be the incorrect punctuation. If a question mark had been there, then there would have been a correct writing sequence between correctly spelled cookie and the question mark. So in this sample, we only have 2 correct writing sequences. In the last sample, I have 30 pairs of shoes. I like shoes. Again, we see we get credit as a correct writing sequence for the first word of the sample being capitalized. There are no correct writing sequences connected with 30 because that is the numeral. At the end of the first sentence, you'll see there's a correct writing sequence between shoes and the period, and then another one between the period and the capital I starting the next sentence. For CBM spelling, you need to have a word list ready, so you could get that word list either from sampling through the curriculum, or some schools still use a controlled word list. They have a set spelling word list that they're using each week. And you're going to do 3 sets of 20 words, and these are timed probes, so a 2-minute assessment, and you dictate the words to the student. And here what we're looking at are correct letter sequences. So correct letter sequences are pairs of letter in a word in proper sequence. So for each word, the total possible correct letter sequences will be the number of letters that make up the word plus 1. And you assume there's a space holder at the beginning and the end of each word. So for some context, think about what this does. By looking at correct letter sequences, it's similar to why we look at digits correct per minute. If I administered 10 spelling words to a student and just scored them based on the percent of the words they spelled correctly, I can just go from 10%, 20%, 30%, or 1, 2, 3. So my intervals are 1 or 10. And so that kind of limits the range of performance and how sensitive the measure is to growth over time. If we do correct letter sequences, now in our list of 10 words, and each word has at least 5 letters in it, now we've got a range of 0 to 50, and we can see growth in that by intervals of 1. So there's a greater range to see improvement over time. The measure is going to be more sensitive. Now, it was the same thing as the case with math. If I do 10 math problems, again, I can get 10%, 20%, 1 correct, 2 correct. Now, if the solution to each of those problems has 5 numbers in it, 6 numbers in it, now we're up to 50 to 60 correct digits correct, and we can have a greater range and room for growth and monitoring progress. Here are some samples. So for banana, again, you'd give a correct letter sequence for that kind of placeholder to start the word, and also end the word. So here we have the 7 correct letter sequences, which, as I mentioned before, when a word's spelled correctly, it comes out to be the number of letters in that word plus 1. In the second example, the word should have been book, and the student wrote B-O-K. So looking at this word, we would have a correct letter sequence for the B, because that is the correct start of it. And then from the B to the O, that's a correct letter sequence. But then there should be another O. So that O should have connected to another O, and then that other O should have connected to the K. So even though it is true in book there is an O and an O and a K connected, in sequence. Here, this we gave credit for it being in sequence with the B. So, and then at the end we would give a correct letter sequence for the K, which is the correct ending sound. So it would be 3 correct letter sequences. And again, for interpreting your scores, you're going to look to local or national norms and then empirical benchmarks. And there are fewer empirical benchmarks established for writing and spelling as there have been for reading, but you can get norms through AimsWeb for some of these measures, and then just published data from historical studies.